Welcome everyone for our third session, and today it's specifically on relationship building and mapping the community. And I thought this was, and with the JCPA team, Melanie and Haya, and Melanie, sorry she can't join us today, and I'm thrilled Haya's with us. I thought this was a really important one, and I want to just share briefly why I thought it was important. The first reason is because it's our bread and butter. I mean, if you look at what our distinguishing factor is as JCRCs, there are a number of things. We've reviewed them when we've talked about the value-added proposition. But at the end of the day, at the heart of our work, day in and day out, is relationship building. Secondly, it sounds easy. We're all in this work because we like engaging with people around the tough issues. We are probably a little bit in this work because we love the unbelievable challenge of bringing together people with diverse views and figuring out how we can move forward together, because we think that in that process we end up with something that is the strongest possible outcome for our community. And with all of that, I find that there's a tendency not to fully maximize the relationship building possibilities. And by relationship building, I want to be clear, I mean the continuum from one-on-one relationships to coalitions around specific issues. And what for me is the differentiator ultimately is how far have we developed relationships to the point where we can pick up the phone and call the right person on the right issue and get the kind of quick response that we want to get onto that issue. And how much do those relationships enable us to move from being reactive to proactive? Because at the end of the day, we tend to get drawn in or sucked in by the crisis of the moment, which in turn then inhibits our ability to go out and build more relationships. And those relationships actually enable us to be much more efficient in our work. It lets us to go from point A to point B to resolve an issue. If, for example, we have a relationship with the superintendent of public schools and an issue arises in the school, imagine how much more a straight line that is than if we have to kind of go around it. So two things I want to say by way of introduction, three things I want to say. My hope is that by the end of today, you'll feel more comfortable in going out there and making relationship building as strategic as possible within your JCRC work, understanding that you're inevitably, whether you're in a large JCRC, a small JCRC, you're inevitably going to ask the question, how am I going to find time to build that additional relationship or to maintain that relationship, and what's the value of putting the energy into that relationship, but determine that it's actually ultimately a time saver to engage in strategic relationship building. So that's number one. And number two, I want to sort of share this interesting observation that that I learned early on from my mentor, Earl Rabb. That is to say, one can go into a typical office in the Jewish community. This is not to disparage any Jewish organization. I'm just talking about cultural imperatives within Jewish life. One can go into a Jewish organization, look around, see all these empty desks because nobody's around, and ask the question, where is everybody today? Isn't anybody working? But if you go into a JCRC office and ask that question and nobody's there, the right answer, in my opinion, is they're out doing their job. They're out getting there in the community. So I say that because out there in the community, I say that because it can be in any job one's in, comfortable to remain longer in the office over the course of a day than it is to get out and go out and do stuff. And so my hope is, in addition to everything else, that we recognize that sometimes we're doing our job best when we can't be found in our office, when we're out there interacting with the community. And that's a mindset that we have to help train other folks in. the last kind of pre-thought is this is not singular. This is not just about your relationship. This is about the network of relationships that you also enable. It may be that there are some times where, you know, rabbis in the community may have the best relationship with certain religious leaders in the community. And you may think, as long as I know that Rabbi so-and-so has a great relationship with the Catholic Archbishop, it's not imperative that I invest too much time in that relationship, because I can call Rabbi X. But that's part of putting that map together to know who has that access, who has that instant access, in order to be able to leverage those relationships in ways that redound to the benefit of the Jewish community and the total community. So you're not to see this as a solo opportunity. You have to pick and choose, you know, which are the ones that will have the greatest value for you personally to engage in. And I also have to say, I think one of the, you know, one final introductory comment, and I enjoy saying this a lot, that one of the great wonders of being able to, and privileges of being able to work in the Jewish community relations field is that you get to see, and I say this gently, you get to see that pretty much every other community is more dysfunctional than the Jewish community. And there are a lot of folks out there who never get the opportunity to see that. But to be able to see how other communities work and how they're organized and so on can only be an advantage in terms of our work in the Jewish community. But it's also something that can refresh us in our work. The fact that we have this opportunity over the course of a week to interact potentially with, you know, representatives from the Muslim community, from the Latino community, from public officials, from university administrators, whoever it might be, creates a variety of exposure to different cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, political backgrounds, and the like, that is very rare in American life. And so the fact that our job by definition requires us to get out of our silos is something that I also think is good for the soul as well as good for the strategy. So I want to open up with that thought of why I wanted to focus this session on mapping and relationship building. And with that, by way of our weekly introduction to each other, I want to go around and ask each participant to share one relationship you've built within the non-Jewish community that you're proud of and that you think has been helpful to the JCRC. Understanding that there are folks who've been on the job for, 2 minutes, and there are folks who've been on the job for, substantially longer. But why don't we go around just one relationship and, say something about it. We introduce your name and community as we go. So why don't we start with you, Noam? And just remember to take yourself off mute when you jump in.
Good afternoon and morning to everyone. Thanks to Doug for doing this again. Hi, for setting it up. I was really thinking hard about this question, and it's not an easy one to give an answer for. Our JC. I'm not a JCRC director. I'm the Israel and International Affairs Director. So we've got a whole other department that's focused on intergroup relations, where one of the things I am responsible for though is missions to Israel. And on those missions, those missions are tools to build relationships with others. So there are a couple of relationships that I'm very proud of. Some are more significant, I think, than others. For example, we took a mission of New York City Council members to Israel just a few months ago, many of them for the first time. And because of those relationships we built on that trip, we've been able to use the access of City Council to get into places where we weren't able to before. For example, some of you may have heard there was a school, an elite public high school here in Manhattan called the Beacon School, which held a tribute to those who died in Gaza, who were, as many of us know, mostly members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. through our contacts at the city council, who were on the Israel trip with us, we were able to get a meeting with the principal of the school, and now we're working with her and our friends over the Institute for Curriculum Services to make sure that they have the proper resources to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in great detail. That's the big one that I'm thinking of in terms of how these relationships provide us access to places we otherwise wouldn't have connections.
Great, and I just want to add, thank you, Noam, and I just want to add that that Israel trips for key non-Jewish leaders, which a number of communities do on an annual basis, some do on a every 3 or 4 years basis, is, I think, a program that one can often identify separate resources for, grant money and separate resources for, and I always was struck by what it meant for the folks that we took to be willing to give up 10 days of their time. When you fly from the West Coast, you do it for 10 days. You fly from the East Coast, it's usually a little shorter. But they're giving us 10 days and trusting us with everything for 10 days. And the amount of time that that's devoted to, relationship building. I mean, in San Francisco, there was a hard-fought race for mayor 2 weeks ago after the tragic death of our mayor, and the person who won, a young African-American political leader, we took to Israel just before she announced her first run for public office. The fact that we already have that pre-existing relationship will pay dividends, I think, for years. So thank you for mentioning that. Ben? And great.
Hello. Ben Friedman from Orlando. There's a young woman in town. Her name is Anna Eskamani, and she's sort of become like a local political celeb. She grew up here, and she's got a really great backstory, and she's started as a community organizer, and she's actually running for office for the first time. But she's the kind of person who's knows everybody in town, and I've really gotten to know her quite well since I've started here, and we've really become friends, and on more than one occasion it has really paid off for us. As one example, after the tragedy in Parkland, there was a supposed interfaith vigil at a local church that was organized by a gun violence prevention group, and several people reached out to me, and I had never heard about it. Several people reached out to me afterwards saying that they saw like a Facebook event for it, and they went for it and were disappointed that there was no Jewish representation. And none of our community rabbis, I had never heard anything about it, so it's not that there was a decision that we decided not to go. We just had not been included. And so I mentioned this to Anna in one of my conversations with her, and she immediately reached out to, and I should say she is not Jewish. She's actually of Iranian descent. And so she immediately reached out to the people who organized it and put them in touch with me. And we had a conversation about it, and everyone was really sorry about it. And not only is our JCRC now a part of that coalition, but I have been added to the steering committee for that coalition. So we know that that's not going to happen again.
Great. And how did you make the first contact?
Believe it or not, I met her sister, and I mentioned in conversation that I had heard about her, and I had not had the pleasure of meeting her yet, and her sister is the person who introduced us.
Great. Terrific. Ari.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, so I'm one of those, I'm obviously one of those new people on the job in Dayton. What I can, I guess, speak of at this point is that I did sort of through, a serendipitous set of channels. I wound up going to a session on, a training session on justice and criminal sentencing reform, and wound up meeting somebody who works for the YWCA in the Cincinnati area, which is near to Dayton, who's actually done a lot of work of the variety that we're trying to get started in Dayton. So, I mean, again, it's not much as of yet, but just sort of getting out and being around has already led to me meeting some of the people that are good to be in relationship with.
Great, terrific. Thank you. Aaron?
Yeah, so one of the biggest ways that we have connected with other communities is actually through the Muslim community here. We have formed a really good relationship with the executive director of the Muslim Alliance of Indiana. And in January or February, there was a question of whether a mosque should be built in Carmel, Indiana. And through that, we really supported the Muslim community, came out and showed them that we would show up for their right to have a place of worship. And through that relationship, we've really been able to navigate some difficult conversations and situations.
Okay, terrific. Karen?
Hi. I'm here in Rochester, New York, director of the JCRC here. Proudest of or happiest about would be two different things. So I have formed a relationship with two Muslim women who created a group called the Muslim Volunteer Network to help Syrian refugees through the local mosque. One of them is, she works for Catholic Family Center, which is our refugee placement organization locally, and she saw the need. So we formed that relationship when our JCRC responded immediately after the first and subsequent executive order Muslim ban, and reached out to all of the local refugee agencies to invite them to talk with us about what the needs were and decide what we could do to make a difference. So I would say that we've made relationships with various actually 5 or 6 local refugee serving agencies. And I think that has definitely been a positive for those groups to see the Jewish community standing for refugees. But when I go back to what I said about personally, I really just have been thrilled to get to know these two particular women, Muslim women, on a personal level. So it's sort of a both proud of, but also I get the benefit of being with two really remarkable women.
And that's part of what I was saying, is that oftentimes these relationships are extra personally nourishing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So appreciate you're mentioning that. Thank you. Yep. Jacob, I know you've just joined your work, so I'm eager to hear what you have to say.
I mean, technically, I still have not started. I start next week as my first day. So I've had relationships. The closest I could say is when I've been in touch with my supervisor about how the first few weeks, it's all about meeting dozens of people, sitting down, having the coffee, because you started at the beginning, and then you're able to build it from there. And so that's the closest I could say in the position, unfortunately, at this point.
Great. Terrific. We'll be eager to hear. Rachel.
Hi, I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I was very excited about 1.5 years ago when I first started this portfolio. I'd already been at Federation. We talked to the JCRC director, and I am the director of intergroup outreach, spoke about wanting to connect with the Latino community. And it took me about 9 months of connecting with different people in the community, going to churches, going to different groups, before finally landing on a partner in the community. We've held our first dialogue group with the Latino community in January and February. We're embarking on our second round of dialogues in the fall. And it's a connection that was just a lot of reaching out to people I didn't know and just trying to create relationships. And now we've got this really strong partner who really had no connection or knowledge of the Jewish community, and now has become a dear friend that I meet with regularly, and a way to connect with a community that we really didn't know.
Great. And Rachel, when you say meet with regularly, what does regularly mean? Just so folks have a sense of that.
Well, right now he and I are in the process of planning our next dialogue group, and so we've been meeting every other week for coffee.
Wow. Okay, great. That is regular.
And we actually happen to live 10 minutes from each other, even though we both work on the opposite side of town. So we try to schedule things first thing in the morning before we leave our neighborhoods.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Brandon.
Well, I'm not officially with the JCRC, but I have for years been a community organizer with a lot of leaders of marginalized groups, and I've found that having that relationship has been really important in a lot of ways, not just for myself, but it's good to have a Jewish person around, and I was kind of the Jewish person around all the time, because when people run into issues, when they're not sure if something is negative towards the Jewish community or anti-Semitic or have trouble with something or want to know something about Judaism, I seem to be the person that they always call. Last year, before I started working here, I actually diffused the situation between the Jewish community and the Black community, where the Jewish community was doing a Holocaust memorial reading at one of the city council meetings. At the same city council meeting, a local Black leader wanted to talk about the Confederate flag being offensive, and was told by a lay leader that he shouldn't go to this city council meeting because it would be disrespectful to the Jewish people. And she called me up to see what the deal was with that before he made a public rant about it, and really went on the offensive. And we were able to kind of diffuse the situation before it came to that. And those two people ended up working together for several years after that, and really running a lot of programs together, whereas before they were kind of destined to clash. So it can be really important. I can see how those relationships would be important to a JCRC.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. And great examples. Melissa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess kind of like Karen, a little different, but it's proud is a loose term, I would say, but important. I don't know. We have the Christian Broadcasting Network. CBN is headquartered 10 minutes down the road from my office.
And Melissa, are you in Tidewater?
Yes, in Virginia Beach. Sorry.
That's what I thought. Okay, great.
I'm in Tidewater. And so we have Pat Robertson and his son in the 700 Club about 10 minutes down the road from us every day. We found that going in there I found going in there with a narrow path is really beneficial to us. We had an anti-BDS bill that was going through the Virginia General Assembly last year, and we needed a way to reach the hundreds of thousands of Virginians who live kind of in the middle of nowhere, Virginia, for lack of a better term, with no Jewish representation. So we partnered with CBN and the 700 Club, and we got some of our speakers and some of our officials and some important lay leaders onto CBN's broadcast to kind of broadcast out to those people around the world, but mostly to those Virginians, why the bill was important and why they should call their legislators to vote a certain way. And it's been really helpful. I actually got to know my contact there. When I was in high school and college, I used to go to APAC policy conference and I would lobby, and I actually met him that way. And then when I started in this role, we kind of already had sort of a personal relationship, so it was nice to be able to call him and say, I'm having this sort of issue. Can we get coffee? Can we go out to lunch? Can we chat?
Great.
So it's nice, and it's a little nerve-wracking, but it's nice to have them there.
Great. Thank you. Linda. Linda Scherzer.
Doug?
Now we can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay. Thank you. So we have spent the last year, I would say, in trying to deepen and strengthen our relationships in the legislative community, both with our elected lawmakers as well as their staffs. And we did that through a very focused Washington mission last year with leaders in our community. as well as a mission to Israel with our state association, which represents all the New Jersey federations. But it was an opportunity, as Noam said, to create those relationships with lawmakers in Israel. And the immediate benefit was when we came back, one of the legislators who represents the district, one of the districts in my catchment area, an African-American legislator, was a co-sponsor of a bill that affirms the Jewish people's connections to Jerusalem, that outright condemned UNESCO's efforts to deny that connection. And he is very much on board with the pro-Israel community right now. It was his first trip to Israel, and absolutely a product of that experience, of that 10-day experience with us.
Great, terrific. And I think we've already gotten a sense of the range of different categories, if you will, that relationships can be built in and nurtured. And I just want to emphasize two things, because I think these are all wonderful examples. The first is, and they're probably both obvious, but the first is the multiplier impact. I probably said this in a previous in a previous session, but our community, I think, buys into the myth that Jews are overrepresented in everything, and therefore we must be much more than the 2% of the population that we are nationwide. But the reality is that we are 2% of the population, that sometimes our competitors, even adversaries, have become increasingly active, building relationships in other areas, and that if we're absent from those tables, or if we're not engaging in those relationships, then our ability to multiply our impact is compromised. So what I loved is in this introductory piece, so many of you gave examples of multiplying our impact and of understanding that there are times where it would be even more effective if there were a non-Jewish voice chiming in on something of concern to us than if there were a Jewish voice, just as sometimes a Jewish voice can be even more helpful to other communities as well. So that multiplier impact, I think, is really important. The second is, I would say that the Jewish community, and I don't mean by this our field, has never been so good at follow-up and maintaining relationships overall. We just get consumed by the next thing that we have to work on. And, I think of all the, gazillion missions that have gone to Israel over the years, and how difficult it is to schedule those reunions and those follow-ups and the like. And it's on all of us. And there's, reality sets in. This is not a criticism. It's just a note to say that we have to be more conscious about when was the last time I did go out to coffee with so-and-so, kind of keep that list in front of us and make sure that we're keeping that relationship warm. Because you never know when that relationship is going to, need to be called upon. When something pops up in a particular sector, it's often something that you couldn't anticipate. Sometimes you can, but often it's something you can't. So keeping those relationships warm is really critically important. My standard, and I've said this many times, is to think, I know this is really hard, but to me it sounds doable, is to think in terms of at least 2 interactions with folks in the broader community per week. At least 2. I mean, if you think of it, that's not a whole lot of a week. And ideally, those are either reinforcement of existing relationships or new relationships, and preferably new relationships. But that's like 100 a year. That's amazing. But if you think of it in terms of like, have I made those 2 outreach calls this week to set up coffee, to set up lunch, to to be sure that conference on justice and criminal reform, whatever that conference was on, is something that I'm going to, go and try to network at. Whatever it is, to try and build that into one schedule, I think is critically important, because time and time again, it will redound to the benefit of our community. So thank you all for that. Now, I didn't find anything that's written explicitly for the Jewish community relations field, and we didn't put it in the manual. But I really like this one piece I sent out in advance. I don't know if you took a look on it, because there's this term of art now called asset mapping, and the idea being that one, and much of it is sort of neighborhood, like who's in my community that I can call upon for different kinds of things. And I hope you all had a chance to at least browse it. But what I liked is it says here on this chart, why map assets? And it says community asset mapping is the identification of resources and connections, talents, skills, communications, and capacities already available in the community, and not what is missing. And I think that's really a wonderful way to think of it. It's like, how am I building that set of assets that JCRC can call upon, those influentials, those voices who can help boost our impact in the community by looking at those various talents that are out there. And the talent may be simply that somebody has particular influence in a particular community, or that person has multiple political connections, or that person is just, knows all the right people in the interreligious sector, or whatever else it may be. But I love that idea of thinking of it as it grows our base of talents and skills beyond that which we singularly can have. Secondly, it maximizes access to these resources and leverages the development of additional resources. And thirdly, asset mapping brings together individuals, industry, nonprofits, educational systems, faith-based groups, and coordinates them around a common goal and vision, which is ultimately the idea of either multiple relationships potentially yielding coalitional opportunity. And then it talks about 5 categories in general that people might fall into: individuals, nonprofits, faith-based groups, publicly funded institutions, and private organizations. One can adapt all of this, but I think what I really wanted to do is to sort of help train our mind to think in terms of asset mapping. And by that, it means also being very strategic, like asking ourselves, if I can only in my first year think in terms of reaching out to X number of communities and building X number of relationships, what are the ones that are going to count the most? What are the ones that I think are most important to invest time in? By the way, sometimes you'll strike out. It's kind of like fundraising, right? Sometimes you'll strike out, and sometimes somebody might be too busy, and you'll find that there are plenty of other ways to, plenty of other people to build relationships with. But I want to ask all of you, as you looked this over, does this help you think of a way to be strategic in your relationship building? Because that's ultimately what my goal is here. Did you all take a look at it? Do you find it helpful in terms of how you think about relationship building?
Doug, it's Karen. I do, definitely. We actually, in some ways, the timing couldn't be better. We were just meeting yesterday because we have an opportunity. We've gotten a large grant from a donor to create a center, the name to be determined. Essentially, we started off calling it the Center to Combat Hate. This is somebody who came out of the Charlottesville incident and said, I want to give a large sum. So we're looking at how to bring both community relations together with our Holocaust education program. And we were just sitting yesterday talking about who are the players. So even from the perspective of the list that you give and the mapping, and we talked exactly about that, about needing to do mapping to figure out who we want to put on a steering committee. So I definitely appreciated this.
Great. And again, you can substitute the types of the 5 categories. What I thought was interesting is that this doesn't necessarily come out of the community relations field per se, and yet the categories resonated, that they were not so far off from what we might put. But that general sense of, of looking at the talents, the skills, the opportunities, and the potential benefit of building these relationships so that these relationships can be called upon, I think is really, is really crucial. And what I again want to say is that this is not to deter what I will call opportunistic relationship building, where you might not have otherwise built this relationship, but it just seems, and maybe it wouldn't fit neatly in your strategic map, but there's just an opportunity. Something happened in the community and there's an opportunity there. And that happens, all the time. Somebody walks into your office and says, I'd like help from the Jewish community, working with Syrian refugees. You weren't otherwise necessarily going to be involved on that issue. Somebody comes in and says, the African-American community is looking for, a rabbi to participate in an interfaith event around criminal justice reform. There's an opportunity there. And to figure out how to solidify those opportunities. And I think what often happens in our field is we move so quickly from issue to issue. We check stuff off our list because we're so good at getting stuff done that we sometimes don't retain fully the relationship or the knowledge behind that relationship because we moved on to the next thing. And yet if you think about something like, say, the public school environment, there's always going to be that next thing. There's always going to be that next issue that arises. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about, what I see as the key categories that historically have been most important for the Jewish community relations field to build relationships in. To put it differently, we must have at least a hand in every one of these categories, in my opinion. And then you have to determine community by community where you're going to put the greatest emphasis. So let me name them, and then let's drill down a little bit. One is public officials, by which I mean elected and appointed, by which I mean local, state, and federal. Secondly is ethnic and religious leaders. You know which ethnic communities are most important in your community, whether it's African American, Latino, Asian, Vietnamese. It could be, each community will have its own unique ethnic composition. And religious communities, obviously we know what the range is there. Other key community influential groups. So, for example, in the Bay Area, 2 that would rise to that occasion, without a doubt, would be LGBTQ, which is, for example, huge in San Francisco, and labor community, which some communities will have still in this day a significant labor community and others may not. But those are just 2 examples of beyond ethnic and religious, sort of the other communities. The media. Obviously, today it's no longer just print and broadcast. It's also print, broadcast, and social media. The university environment, if you have universities in your community, and generally I will say the educational sphere, the public educational sphere in particular. Jewish influentials, whether that's rabbis, whether it's major hitters and leaders in the community, obviously important, though most of what we're talking about is external. And then there's a whole host of others that, again, one has to balance our 501c3 status, either through the JCRC or whatever. But for example, in San Francisco, we try to make sure that all of the political club breakfasts are going to have representatives from the, from the Jewish community there, just as one example. So those are some of the areas. I'm not sure I covered them all, where I can't imagine not wanting to try and have a web of relationships. First of all, any big categories that you think I left out? And then second of all, let's drill down a little bit within each of these. Any big categories that you can think of that I missed?
Law enforcement.
Oh yeah, thank you. I had LE on my list, and I'm trying to think what is the one I missed. Law enforcement, LE. Thank you. That's it. Any others? All right, let's drill down a little bit. So on public officials, who do you think within your community, not by name, but by title, are the most critically important public officials for you to have a relationship with?
The mayor.
Mayor, okay, good.
And in our community, the mayor's wife.
Okay, all right, good. What else?
The sheriff or police chief.
Okay, so that's on the law enforcement side, good.
School
What's
board
the other-
officials.
Pardon me?
School board officials.
School board officials, very important, good, thank you.
City council people.
Okay, good. Haya, by the way, can we get this down? Can you help with that?
I'm sorry, get what down?
Just these brainstorming of areas.
Oh, sure. Yep.
That would be
I can
great.
share them afterwards.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm sorry, what was the last one after school board officials?
City council officials.
City council officials, okay, great. Others?
State legislators and in our case, the governor and his staff.
Okay, great. So when you mentioned something important, you mentioned the word staff. So when you say state legislators, city officials, I assume you're also talking about their key aides as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Others?
In our case, town supervisors and our county executive.
Okay, great.
Political party leadership that aren't really elected but are influential, people who are.
Okay, good. All right, great.
And federally elected representatives.
Okay, great. Others? I think one other area, well, maybe two other areas that I would mention are appointees of key commissions where issues of relevance come up. And I will say, for example, again, in the Bay Area, that could be anything from a Human Rights Commission to the Status of Women Commission to the Aging Commission. It could relate to the government affairs work we do. It could relate to issues that arise within the community. But having relationships with these commission appointees can be very important. Relatedly, having relationship with what I'll call the gatekeepers, I think is also important, by which, for example, I mean chiefs of staff of the mayor, for example, and the appointments secretary for the mayor. So the appointments secretary is the one who's going to vet any commission appointments. And we have found to be proactive in that area can be very beneficial to the Jewish community, to identify potential openings on commissions where, again, there might be things relevant for the community. All of these collectively, I think, fall under the category of public officials and some of the areas where it makes sense to look for relationship building. And I'm sure many of you taking folks to state capitals before or to the federal have said to your the people who are going, don't be disappointed if we don't meet with the actual elected representative. The staff people are often more important. They know the issues, and we have to also channel that ourselves when we're building those relationships too. So I wanted to mention that. Secondly, is the area of ethnic and religious communities. So I want to say who are the, not so much which religious and which ethnic communities, because that again will vary community by community, but how do you identify who the key players within those communities are to build the relationship? With public officials, it's obvious, right? You know who they are. So how do you identify with ethnic and religious communities who the key players are?
I mean, you generally want to look for local leaders of national organizations like NAACP and National Action Network, or you can look often to the media to see who comments about important issues facing particular communities. They tend to be influential people, and then you can ask people who they look to for leadership on issues that affect them community wide.
Great. Any other thoughts on this?
In our community, at least, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
In our community, we have a lot of different organizations that bring different religious leaders together, and that helps to be able to identify who's really connected with it throughout Indianapolis.
Okay, great. Other thoughts? So being sure that you're attuned to the kind of the community coalitions is obviously hugely important. Noam?
Check the size of the congregations that we're talking about. If you're looking for a particular religious leader, for example, the rabbi of the 10-person shul is probably not going to be as influential as the rabbi of the 500-person shul.
Right.
I would assume it's the same in other religions.
Right, and this in turn goes back to something I said before, which is you can be only the eyes and ears so much for the community. We benefit by multiplying the number of eyes and ears that we have. So rabbis in the community who may hopefully already have some relationships with interfaith leaders, with leaders in the Catholic and the Protestant and the Hindu and the Mormon and the Muslim and all the other communities, probably have a good sense. If they don't, then they too should be encouraged to build relationships. Something we had to do when we first faced all the BDS issues within liberal Protestant denominations was go to rabbis and say, we need you as an adjunct to activist to be building relationships with local Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, etc. leaders. But they may have a good sense of that. One thing I want to suggest, and I don't think it's done as much as it could be, is to see if you think there are neutral folks who you can go to in the community who have a good sense of the lay of the land. I'll give you an example. Almost every metropolitan area has a community foundation that's working on social issues within that community. They're working on issues of homelessness or affordable housing or poverty or literacy or whatever other issues they are. And there are folks to talk to there who are in charge of the programs who I think can be an enormously valuable resource. They have, and when I say neutral source, I mean they're not community activists who are already, deeply invested in this relationship or that. They can give you an objective assessment of who they think would make the most sense to build relationships with and to look for those neutral sources. And again, to network. When you're meeting with a staff member of a city official and say, I'm looking to build a relationship with some key leaders in the Mormon community or the Latino community or whatever community it is, they too will have a good sense. So not to be afraid to ask that question when you're already building a relationship with somebody else who by virtue of their role would have interaction with other communities too. So I just wanted to strongly encourage that. I mentioned an example in the Bay Area where I think of labor and LGBTQ as sort of above and beyond the ethnic and religious communities. What other examples would you give of kinds of communities that you would want to build a relationship with that don't fit the ethnic and religious communities category?
I mean, there's obviously the LGBTQ community.
Right. But beyond those two, other thoughts?
Well, here in Rochester, we have a very big healthcare community that I think, is tapped into so many issues around poverty, health disparities, et cetera. So that's another, there are various groups that we can connect in with.
Great. I think that's really important.
And
Anyway,
Doug, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
The other quick thing I was going to add, we have a community foundation. That is one group that that I agree is a place for us to definitely be networking. The other is we have a United Way here, and similarly doing it. Actually, this United Way is doing a poverty initiative across the community. So anyway, that's another resource.
Exactly, and I was thinking of that in the same kind of vein. So I appreciate your mentioning that. That's a really good idea. They can be invaluable in terms of building that network, forging those relationships. Other ideas of any other kinds of communities that I left out in that sphere? What about law enforcement? Who do you want to know? The chief of police, the sheriff, anyone else?
I think I'm going to take it a little bit different direction and say also within the law enforcement community, I think it's important to know those who are affected greatly by the law enforcement community.
Okay. So,
If that makes
but are you talking back to ethnic and religious communities as well?
I think that they intertwine.
Okay. All right, good. And now what yeah, please.
Sorry, this is Linda. I'm going to say the Attorney General, who we met with as a federation, but has attorneys general in every county who are bringing together all communities to talk about issues related to homeland security, rising anti-Semitism and hatred. So I think I would put the Attorney General in as somebody important to know and to have a relationship with.
Great. By the way, in San Francisco, in addition, the district attorney wanted to create a task force with representatives of the Jewish community to make sure concerns of the Jewish community were being addressed. So in addition to attorneys general, I'd add district attorneys as well. Others?
Chaplains.
Police chaplains. Okay, good. Good.
Sorry, piggybacking on what Aaron was saying, we have a police accountability board that's forming here.
Good. Okay, great. Also, I don't know if your police department has a hate crimes unit. If it does, it's good to have a relationship with the head of the hate crimes unit. If you have an FBI office, it's good to have a relationship with or make sure somebody in the Jewish community has a relationship with the special agent in charge, which is the name of the head of the FBI office. I think, I think all of these are good. Now, some of us live in areas where we're not so neatly centralized, right? So if you take, for example, the San Francisco Bay Area, we have the city of San Francisco, and then we've got dozens of municipalities that have their own police departments, their own mayors, their own city councils. And you have to obviously prioritize. You have to determine which are the ones that are the most important to have the relationship with. And, obviously there has to be efficiency in the effort, but I'm sure many of us are in areas where we have both a kind of big city, but there also might be individual municipalities as well. What about in the area of schools and education? Where do you think it's particularly important to have a relationship?
Superintendents.
Okay, good. And school boards were mentioned as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Anything else on that end? Pardon me?
PTAs.
PTAs, I think that could be very, very good. So we found it was very helpful to also identify Jewish parents active in the public schools. So
I'd also say Jewish educators.
Jewish educators as well, because if issues arose, they could be, again, part of this is saying, how can I get more eyes and ears out there? Part of it is the relationship building for when issues arise. It's kind of a dual kind of approach. Anything else in that sphere?
I think any local clubs or at high schools or universities.
Okay, great. And obviously, the university environment is a separate environment. Question of whether your JCRC is active, working, supporting a Hillel in the area when it's facing issues. Certainly in our area, with schools like, with significant schools like a Berkeley or a Stanford, and many of you are in areas with significant universities, having relationships or knowing who has the relationships with the head of the university, with members of the Board of Governors or the Board of Regents, with key administrators, with the gatekeepers like the Chief of Staff, and so on, have also been very, very helpful. How do you prioritize with all of these possibilities? Again, you have a part of your job, I think, is to figure out where's the biggest bang for the buck? Where are the most important relationships? What am I going to prioritize this year? What am I going to prioritize next year? And so this is not about thinking that anybody can be totally comprehensive in any of these areas. I think it's good to make sure all of these bases are covered somewhat. That is to say, you've got some important relationships at the public official level, key on the ethnic and religious level, law enforcement to have some relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The public education sphere, all of these are important areas to have relationships, but you can't be thick in all of them. You're going to be thin in some because you're going to have to make, decisions. But you want those decisions to be strategic. You want it to be based on asset planning. You want it to be based on what is going to help build our ability to be as effective as possible. So that's, I think, kind of the way I would encourage approaching it. Before I turn to the scenarios, any which I think are, just intended to help us kind of think through how we approach this subject. Any other thoughts on relationship building priorities?
So if we have parts of the Jewish community that are, for example, we have Jewish studies at the college that have Jewish professors and maintain a relationship with the administration. So we can use that as a relationship, right? I mean, we can.
Absolutely. The answer is absolutely. And again, you'll have to make that case by case decision, right, in terms of when you think it's important for you to directly have it. If you think, for example, that the ability of the Jewish community to make the strongest possible case, if it needs to be, on behalf of the viewpoint of the Jewish community, can be done by a specific professor in Jewish studies, great. If you think that that person's value added, but maybe not fully going to bring that voice to the table, then you may also want to have an independent relationship, but you won't need it to be as extensive as you might in other cases, because you still have this sort of important support. But in other words, one of the challenges, or one of the opportunities, I should say, is to recognize that there are others who can often serve as a key point of contact, and still you may want to say, for us to fully give expression to the viewpoint of the Jewish community, I have to have something of a relationship there as well. So does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Good. I'm really glad you asked that, because again, I want to reinforce the same thing with rabbis, as I said, right? That we want to say, not just we want to not just say, who do I have to have a relationship with? We want to be able to say, who can I count upon to build that relationship? But also, do I have a sense of how far will that go? So at San Francisco State University, which has been an enormous challenge over time, punctuated with some really good years in between, we have an enormously good relationship with Jewish studies, but we've also decided that it was important for us to maintain a strong, direct relationship with the administration, because Jewish studies is also, they're ultimately employees of the university. We're an independent voice. We work in a remarkably cooperative way, and yet we both still need to be at the table. Which brings me to the scenarios. The very first one, and now, Haya, you can put it up quickly. We sent it just before the meeting. But this is the kind of thing I think we'll have to think on our feet with. The first one is a major anti-Semitic incident occurs at the university, that our local university, the response to the university president has been weak, a mild condemnation and no indication of any intent to do more. The Hillel director calls you and suggests requesting a meeting with the university president to press for a much stronger response. You can bring 6 people in addition to the Hillel director to the meeting. Who do you bring? So what's your immediate thought when you hear that question of who do you think is going to, what composition at that meeting is going to have the greatest amount of impact? Thoughts?
Well, I mean, this might be specific to our community, but we have a large donor who's Jewish who funds a great deal of the college, and that I know that she takes personal interest in any issues that involve the Jewish community as it relates to the college, and it also has more impact if there's somebody that has contributed a lot with you.
Okay, so by the way, I think the only thing I would take issue with is every community has somebody like that. So for me, that would be an absolute given, that I would look for somebody who fits that bill, who's close to the Jewish community, and also their level of major donor status at the university is going to get a lot of attention. So great. Who else are you going to bring? We're going to do this shotgun style. There are no wrong answers, right? So we just want to populate this meeting with like the best delegation we can think of. But there are no wrong answers.
If there's like a Muslim or Christian student group on campus, maybe leadership from their groups to show that this is united, this is not how we treat people on our campus.
So potentially a non-Jewish voice, let's say that for sure, whether it's from the campus, off the campus, Muslim, not Muslim, but to make it clear that anti-Semitism is not something that only affects or is a concern to the Jewish community. Great point. Other ideas?
ADL head, student, like Hillel student president.
Okay, good. So a student representative is really important. Now, ADL head, if you have an ADL there, one of the things that I think I have often used as an opportunity to build a relationship with others is to say that JCRC represents their ultimate efficiency, because we're that convening organization that rather than they're having to have 27 different meetings with 27 different Jewish organizations, if they meet with JCRC, we can bring in a representative delegation. So we're going to have somebody from ADL there, maybe somebody from American Jewish Committee there, somebody from the, something else there. I know I said only 6 plus the Hillel director. My point being that the sense of gratitude that can go to JCRC for playing that role so that the campus administrator doesn't have to have 27 separate meetings will be enormous. And it's a legitimate and important and powerful role that JCRCs can play. Other ideas of who you'd bring to that meeting?
Maybe the student involved in the incident.
Right. Okay, great. Good. We didn't say, by the way, although this had been mentioned earlier, somebody from the, an academic. But I think sometimes there is a concern within the university environment about, academic freedom and all these kinds of things. Having an academic there who can help talk the administration into doing the right thing can be also a very helpful asset too. So I think we've got a nice delegation here. Not sure I got it into 6, and I wouldn't sweat it, because you can always go back and say, you know what, I think we're going to bring 7 or 8 people to the meeting. By the way, what are you going to do before the meeting? You're going to treat it like you would a lobbying visit. Mm-hmm. You're going to get everybody on the conference call beforehand, and you're going to come up with an agenda, and you're going to designate 2 or 3 people who are going to be doing the short, each one taking a different initial point, and then people can chime in as well. And you're going to make sure everybody is online. Treat anything that's a group visit of this kind like a lobbying visit. And I think oftentimes it's a lost opportunity if it's not approached that way. So, and again, the relationship building here is also with all the people who are part of the delegation. Not mentioned here is whether you're bringing your JCRC chair. Are you bringing the Federation exec? Are you bringing the Federation president? You want them to see JCRC in action. You want them to see the impact that you have. And they too like to be able to go say, you know what, we just met with the president of the University of so-and-so and be able to do it. So, okay, so we've made it a little larger meeting, but be strategic in terms of thinking who's going to come to that meeting.
Doug, I would just,
please.
Sorry, it's Karen. I would just add one more. We have Holocaust survivors in the community that I would consider bringing.
Okay, great. And again, based on the relationships you have, I think that can be very helpful. So the second one, your board or council wants JCRC to initiate a community coalition against hate. There's concern, however, about not including anti-Israel voices or groups in the coalition. How do you proceed and who do you approach? Quick thoughts on this. I'm just going to do this way quicker than we can do justice to.
Can you clarify this a little bit more, Doug? Your question is?
Sure. So you've been told, let's have JCRC do what several communities have done, build a community coalition against hate.
Right.
But there's a concern, but they say we don't want anti-Israel groups in the coalition. CARE, for example, which comes up, and yet that could be a deal breaker for others. So how do you proceed, and who do you approach to build the coalition? Have any of you done that as, I don't mean necessarily around the issue of hate, but built a coalition which has engaged a number of community groups?
I would be very interested to hear what people have done, because I actually just bumped into somebody with this concern days ago.
Yeah.
I can't get myself off mute. Yes.
So how did you approach it?
I haven't answered it yet. I mean, the approach that I've been, our community in general tends to be very wary of national, ostensibly partisan issues. So the approach that I'm looking at right now is to say that we're going to keep our organization on these kinds of topics local rather than national.
Right.
So that we don't get pulled into the weeds.
Okay, so that's really important. What you're saying is, first of all, have a in a sense an MOU from the get-go of what this is going to cover and what this is not going to cover. Have an agreement that people would agree, would sign on to effectively. Of this is what we're going to cover.
So we have a group that we've created called the Interfaith Coalition of Dignity, made up of people from a different religious and ethnic/cultural spectrum here in the Portland community that responds to local instances of hate. So, for example, last spring we had an unfortunate hate stabbing on our local train system. It was in the national news, and we responded to that. We respond to things that happen. We meet with officials. We meet with people as a united faith and ethnic community, saying this isn't how we respond to things in our community.
Okay, great. And how did you build it?
Very slowly with our connections that our JCRC director has had, that I've made, and then we've branched out with people in the coalition from other religious communities, bringing in additional people that they know.
All right, good. So, I mean, I will just say this for time purposes, but I hope we can come back to this in a later context. And that is that the word trust hasn't been used maybe today by me yet, but you start with folks that you have a deep sense of trust in. And I think you actually share with them, here's what I want to do, and here's what I want to be sure it doesn't evolve into. And you try to make sure that you're not just in the role of being, the sole gatekeeper, but that you built momentum with folks with whom you have trust. So that, from my vantage point, is a critically important thing here. And you identify, I'm a big believer in what I call easy wins. So you identify what's an easy win to start with. What's an issue that we can speak out about around hate that there's not, going to be discord about within the Jewish community, beyond the Jewish community. Is going to be pretty clear that this is an issue that we can build upon. And ultimately, you want to, and ultimately, you need to know that there are going to be times where you're going to have to choose battles over whether this group is allowed in or this group is not allowed in. As long as you've done everything possible to build the parameters of what this is going to do and what this is not going to do. And I think that's critically important. And retain a deep sense of presence there, so that, because ultimately it's about being around the table, and this is what we sometimes have to say to skeptical leaders in our own community. The cost of not being around the table is much greater than the risk of being around the table. The cost of not being around the table is much greater than the risk of being around the table. So I think we have to say that. Hopefully we'll come more, because back to this more, because coalition building is its own art that sort of takes relationship building in a kind of multiplier kind of way. Let me very briefly, and I know we might end 3 minutes late, I apologize, but this last one: when tensions flare after a local African-American leader publicly blasts the Israeli government's policy toward the Palestinians at the community's annual Martin Luther King birthday commemoration, JCRC leaders decide it's essential to build relationships with local African-American leaders. Where and how do you start? Quick thoughts.
I mean, I think you start with a phone call or lunch.
To whom?
You reach out to a mutual friend, if you hopefully the community has one, and get connected. Most people will sit down for a conversation or a meeting with anybody that represents a community.
Great.
My experience.
I mean, you know, maybe somebody's come up to you at the commemoration and said, we were really troubled by what this person said. And then there's an opportunity to kind of see that as an offer, an opening to go out and build a relationship. Again, you go to folks in the community who might already have a good idea. You go to those neutral community-based entities that we've talked about. They could be organizing projects, they could be United Way, they could be community foundations. You go to other community leaders like rabbis, interfaith council leaders, and look at where they think those relationships can be built. But I think it's important to know that in a situation like this, unlike, say, the first one, where you can pretty readily identify who it makes sense to have be a part of that delegation, sometimes you'll be starting a little bit from scratch. And yet, even there are plenty of resources in every community, small or large, that you can go to help identify where that relationship might go. You might determine, by the way, after one meeting with somebody that it was important to meet, but this is kind of a dead end, and you will have to decide whether to expend more relationship. You know, one of the things I learned early on is that in JCRC is that generally dialogue is not something that is looked upon in JCRC life as an end in of itself. If it's a means toward accomplishing a specific goal, it's great. But there are people and groups who would spend inordinate amounts of time engaging us in dialogue, and not to achieve any specific end other than to understand each other. And from my own vantage point, as tempting as it may be to be drawn into that, if it's not going to move the relationship in a way that could have concrete results, at some point I'm going to step a little bit back from that, because dialogue for its own sake is legitimate, but I'm not sure it's where the sweet spot is for JCRC. For us, dialogue is a means to trust building and relationship building that will let us focus on tangible outcomes for the community is important, but not in and of itself. So one always has to make those assessments, and you can't know until you're already a little bit into it and make that judgment. So none of this is is automatic. All of it is trial and error. But main thing that I wanted to introduce into the conversation today is that it can be very strategic, that it is very important, and it can dramatically multiply the impact of a JCRC. We started with countless examples of where having a relationship has already paid off for interests of the Jewish community and the broader community. And, you know, the more we have time to set aside to build those relationships, the more examples we'll have to bring to the table. I hope this has been helpful. I've certainly enjoyed your excellent input today, and As always, I'm available offline to continue conversations around relationship building. Any questions or comments before I wrap it up with 2 final comments?
This is Linda again. Doug, there was one phrase that was said to me early on in my my CRC tenure, and that was enlightened self-interest, building relationships out of enlightened self-interest, which has really been, it stuck with me. These issues that we are engaged with really, mean something. They're profoundly meaningful to us, as Jews, and but they're relationship starters, they're relationship builders, and
Exactly.
I just think it's been it's really guided my my relationship building and advocacy, enlightened self-interest.
Great. And when we did the discussion of the history and the values of JCRC, one of the things I tried to emphasize is that Tikkun Olam gets a lot of play and is very important to many of our members and is an important Jewish value. And at the same time, I think one that is more of a definition of JCRC is a different Jewish value, which is Mipnei Darchei Shalom, the Talmudic commandment that we care for non-Jews along with Jews. We feed non-Jews, we clothe non-Jews along with Jews, we bury non-Jews as we would bury Jews. Precisely, it says Mipnei Darchei Shalom, for the sake of good neighborly relations. And that is the Talmudic equivalent of enlightened self-interest. And so we carry on that tradition exactly in this kind of work. So I really appreciate your mentioning that. 2 final things. Well, 3, I guess. One is, as always, Haya will send out the evaluation form, and we appreciate your sending it out. Secondly, this is the conclusion of the first series, and the series number 2, which is JCRC 202, Strengthening the JCRC's Core, will begin in 2 weeks on July 10th, because next week, of course, we have Independence Day. If you haven't signed up, there's still, I think, some room, and you're welcome to. And we will be focusing on identifying and retaining strong lay leadership, the Balancing Act, on local and national policies, a government affairs training, meeting facilitation, and how to position the JCRC as a highly valued institution within the Jewish community and beyond. So welcome your participation. And finally, I want to thank all of you and Haya. Haya put together, and I will send out, I don't think it went out yet, a summary. Did it go out?
No, I'm going to include it in the evaluation link that goes out.
And this was the assignment of what is unique about the JCRC and why should JCRC be a top community priority in 30 seconds or less from last week. And I think almost everybody put it together. We've put it together in a neat set of bullets, and feel free to, I will say this on everybody's behalf, and if you feel to the contrary, you'll let folks know, but feel free to lift from anybody's bullets to help strengthen your case. But overall, I think they were excellent statements, compelling statements, and succinct statements about what makes JCRC so unique and important, and should be therefore valued in our community. So thank you for staying on a few extra minutes today. A lot to cover in the area of relationship building. As I said at the outset, it is the core bread and butter of the work we do. And it is also what enables us to move more from being reactive to proactive and strategic in our work on a daily basis. So glad we could spend some time on this subject. Thank you all for your participation, and hope I'll see many of you on the next series. Thanks all.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.